Hey everyone, this is the last lecture on the muscular system. I bet you're happy about that. Well, I should say the last lecture on the muscular system as the basic anatomy and physiology. Next, we're going to start on all the muscles. So, anyway, let's get started with this last series. And so the first slide here talks about muscle fatigue and oxygen debt. We discussed in our last lecture how important oxygen is in making ATP through aerobic cellular respiration. When there's not enough oxygen, when you've been exercising for a while or exercising for a small amount of time at a very high intensity, muscles can get fatigued. And when they get fatigued, they're unable to contract. And the reason why is that you're in what we call oxygen debt. And so the oxygen has to be repaid to the tissue to get rid of that oxygen debt. When we are in oxygen debt, we know it because our muscles start to burn, and that burning comes from the accumulation of lactic acid that's building up due to the anaerobic respiration that's going on, that glycolysis. So just repaying the oxygen debt basically means that we need to just stop or slow down so that our muscles can replenish the amount of oxygen. We also need to talk about the two types of muscle contractions, isotonic versus isometric. For those of you that are familiar with exercising and working out and probably in your extracurricular athletic workouts, you do both isotonic exercises as well as isometric exercises. So what does that mean? Well, we need to know the definitions. Isotonic contractions are when the myofilaments are able to slide past each other, right? The muscle shortens. These are the types of contractions that we observe when we have to lift something or carry something, or we're jumping, or actually when we're using our leg muscles to lift something. But this is when you have the shortening of the muscle fibers. Okay, isotonic. Isometric contractions are when you have tension on the muscles, but there's no shortening. And so it would be like walking up a set of stairs. That would be an isometric type of exercise, right? Because our calf muscles are not really shortening, but they're still doing work, and there's still tension that's created in those muscles, in those calf muscles. Pushing against a wall, right? The wall is immovable. We can't really move it, but we are, maybe pushing against it. So those are examples of isometric. So isometric contractions, no shortening, but increasing tension. Isotonic, the muscle shortens with tension. Okay. Moving on, muscle tone. So we always hear about muscle tone. What is muscle tone? Well, muscle tone is a continuous state of partial muscle contraction. And you get this continuous state of partial muscle contraction when your muscles are kind of used to being contracted. So the more you work out, and the more the muscles are worked, right? The more the muscles are contracted, those muscles exhibit more muscle tone. So, and then we need to talk about muscle and body movements. This is the last, next to the last item on this series of slides. So, muscles and body movements. We need to know the 2 points of attachment of a muscle. Usually, muscles that are prime movers are situated where they're attached across a joint. So, they're attached to the bone more proximal to the joint, and then the bone that's more distal to the joint. And so we call those the origin and the insertion. So the origin and insertion. The origin is the attachment that is on the immovable bone. And this bone is usually more proximal, right, to the joint. And then the insertion is on the movable bone, right? And that's going to be more distal to the joint. Okay, so the origin and the insertion. Oh, and here they are again. Okay, so the effects of exercise on muscle. Increase in muscle size is going to be an effect if you're training for strength, right? If you're doing low reps with high weight, you're going to increase the muscle size, you're going to increase strength, you're going to increase muscle efficiency, and the efficiency and the resistant to fatigue is going to come more from aerobic training, so endurance training. So these two are the results more of endurance training, where these two results are more from strength training. There's some body movements we need to go over. I have some, you should see the images of these in your textbook, but we need to understand these. So flexion and extension, rotation, abduction, and circumduction are the common ones that we go over. So let's look at these. Flexion, we can see back here, you're flexing the knee, right? You're decreasing the angle across that joint, right? And then extending it would be to increase the angle of the knee, right, of that joint. And then we also have something called hyperextension. So hyperextension, I like to use the head down here. Hyperextension, we have extension if we're holding our head straight, kind of in line with our body. But if we hold our head backwards, that's hyperextending. So we're hyperextending our head when we tilt our head backward. Flexion is tilting the head forward. So flexion, extension, and then hyperextension. And then we also have rotation. We have rotation in certain joints. The most common one that we talk about is the pivot joint of the cranium, pivoting or rotating on the dens of the axis. And then circumduction. Circumduction is just kind of making a circle. Only certain joints are able to circumduct. And then abduction and adduction. Abduction is like you're abducting something. So abducting is taking something away. So we're moving our limb. Usually when we talk about abduction and adduction, we're referring to either the arm or the leg. So abduction is moving it out, away from the body. And then abduction is adding it to the body or moving it towards the body. And that would be both, the arm and the leg for abduction and adduction, as well as circumduction. Circumduction we can do with our leg at the hip as well. And then we have inversion and eversion. Inversion and eversion refers to the position of the feet and rotation or movement at the ankle. So inverting the foot would be pointing the soles of our feet inward from the ankle, and then eversion, pointing them outward. Sometimes people develop hip problems or back problems because they walk with their feet more inverted or everted. And this can cause a lot of back pain and hip pain. And then dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is flexing the foot. So dorsiflexion is just flexing the foot. And then plantar flexion, I always remember plantar flexion, P, pointing the toes, right? So plantar flexion. And then supination and pronation. Supination is holding or rotating the forearm at the elbow so that the palm is facing up. And I always remember this, I used to remember it with soup. Like you could, if you cupped your hand, you could hold some soup in it, maybe. And then pronation is turning it the other way, so palm down. So pronation is palm down. The last part of this lecture is all about how muscles are named, because that's what we're going to start next, right? Is learning the different muscles of the body. And so let's look at what some of these names or naming mechanisms mean. So when we see the term rectus, rectus does not refer to rectum. Rectus means straight. So, for example, the rectus abdominis. The rectus abdominis are those muscles that run vertically in the middle of the abdomen. Those are the ones that give you the washboard look. So the rectus means that these fibers are nice and straight, or the muscle is nice and straight, running vertically. And then relative size, there's a lot of different size terms. One of them is maximus. So we have gluteus maximus. That means that's the largest gluteal muscle. We also have gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. And so you can get from those terms which one's the largest and which one's the smallest, which one's the medium size, right? Maximus, medius, and minimus. We also have muscles that are named for their location or named for the bone that they cover. And so one of those will be the temporalis. And obviously the temporalis is named for the temporal bone. A lot of the cranial bones, for example, the occipitalis is named because it covers the occipital bone, right? The zygomaticus covers the zygomatic bone. So a lot of these that are named for the bone that it covers are in the cranium and the face, and you'll see that. The next one is the number of origins, right? So the best example of the number of origins is triceps. Triceps means that the muscle has 3 heads or 3 origins. So it's attached 3 different places on that bone. Okay. Biceps would be Another one, biceps, has two heads and it's attached to different locations on the humerus. The location of the muscle's insertion and origin. An example would be a muscle called the, let's see, the sternocleidomastoid. So let's look at that one. Sternocleidomastoid. And mastoid. So sterno means that it is going to originate in the sternum, and cleido refers to the clavicle. So it has two origins: one on the sternum, one on the clavicle, and then it also originates on the mastoid process. So it goes from the mastoid process. Here's our origin. And then these two would be insertions. Okay, so they're named for their origin insertions. The deltoid muscle is an example of another way that muscles are named. Sometimes they're named for their shape. So the deltoid obviously looks like a delta, right? Three-sided triangular shape. And then there's another one called the trapezius. And the trapezius obviously has a shape kind of like a trapezoid, right? Four-sided trapezoid. So the action of the muscle would be another one. Flexors and extensors. We have lots of flexors and extensors in our forearms and our lower legs. So they're going to tell whether that muscle is going to flex that bone or it's going to extend that bone. Okay, so that is it for this last lecture. And like I said, you'll be getting your study guide for this unit. Look on your agenda to see when the test will be over this unit. And then we will be starting next week, we'll be starting the muscles themselves. So learning the muscles. All right? Okay. So make sure you email me if you have questions. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.